This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello and welcome to the podcast, where today I'm joined by food writer and fermentation expert Rachel de Thample to explore how a few simple jars in the kitchen can transform not only the flavour of our harvests, but potentially our health too. We chat about rewilding the gut microbiome, preserving the seasons through fermentation, and why making your own fermented foods is far easier and much safer than many of us imagine.
My sort of professional background is journalism initially. I really wanted to be a war correspondent, didn't end up taking that path, and decided I wanted to write about food. For similar reasons, I was interested in sort of international media and covering the broader world and conflict. And I remember watching the Berlin Wall fall down when I was a kid, and that just seeing major world events. But I think food is equally complex subject that's also really important for global relations. And it's economic, it's ecologic, it's culturally deep, the deepest cultural human experience, because we need to eat to live. And then the way food's evolved and changed, I think it's just such an incredible subject. So I have no regrets about having a slight diversion in the road to my career path. And I wanted to write about food. So I decided that a good avenue into food writing was to work in a kitchen. So I initially worked in Market Pierre White's Quo Vadis for a very short period of time. I was there about a year, maybe 9 months even. It felt like a year because I was working 16, 18 hour shifts a lot, 6-7 days a week. So I barely saw the light of day. And then I wanted to experience a few other kitchens. So I worked very, very briefly at the Providores with Peter Gordon, who is no longer UK based, but he's at the forefront of fusion cuisine, which was really interesting about marrying different flavors. So he'd have like Persian pistachios with miso, which has really shaped a playfulness in the way I approach cooking and food and recipe writing. And then I also had a very brief stint at the Fact Up with Heston Blumenthal when he was very much, there, and he's still very much involved. My son took me for my 50th birthday this year, and it was such a great present to be back and to be there with him. But again, he has a playfulness with food, which I don't take it to the high level that he does, but I try to play a lot with memory and a bit of playfulness when I approach recipe writing. So it's been fun sort of going into the fermentation side of food, which I've evolved into from, being more of a general food writer and working in a kitchen to having fermentation as my main subject, because it's probably the most playful area of food, I think, that you can imagine. I was like almost late for the podcast because I was finishing up. I did an online course making sauces. So I basically ferment everything. And in my new book, I've, turned my favorite banana bread recipe into a sourdough recipe, and then thought, how can I get more flavor and how can I get more microbes? So I blended the skins into it, which is zero waste as well, but it adds a depth in other levels. So all of those experiences have really contributed to, the things I'm doing now and the writing.
Yeah, I mean, you can totally see that. So I was very lucky to get a copy of your new book, and I opened it and I've very much dabbled myself, and I'm sure we'll come on to this, but I'm a little bit of a fearful fermenter.
Yeah, a lot of those.
Yeah, I'm sure you do. And because it's like alchemy, and some of the stuff that you put in your book, I was just like, well, this is mind-blowing. I had no idea that this was even a thing. So yeah, I can completely see that. And I imagine for the experienced fermenter, it's still going to be, wow, I didn't even know you could do that, because there's so much kind of novel stuff in there, and it's just super interesting. But to kind of take a step back to what you were saying about getting more flavour into things and getting more health benefits into it, the subtitle of your book is Everyday Techniques and Recipes to Rewild Your Biome. And I thought that would be a really good place to start thinking about how kind of these foods affect your health. I mean, what do you mean by that?
Well, this sort of subtitle was inspired by watching Isabella Tree's Wilding documentary, so based on her book. And especially watching it on film, because they did, stop motion, so they were showing the land recovering. And it really reminded me of my own health journey, because I had an experience where I did a microbiome test after feeling really lethargic and tired all the time. I was having achy joints, and my mother had just had knee replacements. And I was I was in my early 30s when I had a microbiome test. And I should have felt amazing because I was actually eating quite a good diet. But I took a lot of antibiotics as a child. And I'm pretty certain that's why when I got my test results back, there were no good bacteria at all and a couple of bad ones. So I kind of had, in terms of a diversity score, at 0 out of 10. And I started to introduce fermented foods after a bit of what often is called a reset, where you pare back your diet, kind of like when you're weaning children. If they react badly to something, you take it back to the basics. I was just having more of a paleo diet, so meat and vegetables and no sugars, no alcohol, no caffeine, all the frills that come along with the modern diet. I stripped out and then started introducing fermented foods, starting with kefir, dairy kefir. And dairy kefir has the largest sort of diversity of microbes of all the fermented foods that have, or at least very top of the tree. And I started having small amounts of that and then introducing other fermented foods. And I really almost instantly, I had to do this kind of 6-week reset before. So it wasn't like an overnight. I had a spoonful of kefir, but pretty quickly, I would say after 2 months, I felt completely different. But I had almost the opposite extreme of I was really energetic and the achy joints went away. And I also had a physical benefit, which I have psoriasis, and it completely went away. And it could sometimes, anyone who suffers from psoriasis or eczema knows it can be really debilitating. Normally in the middle of the night, you wake up really itchy, inflamed skin. And that just completely went away. And I was blown away by that. And I started making my own fermented foods as a result. But what I find interesting is that parallel between like land recovery and microbiome recovery. And I've written a couple of articles about the link between soil and gut health. And now there's a new book out by someone else about that as well, relating the difference. Because a lot of our soils over time, especially since the 50s, since the industrialization of food and farming, our microbiomes have suffered. And that's because our soil's less organic and we're feeding it less and it's less diverse. And the food we're eating is less diverse. Therefore, it's having a direct impact on our microbiome.
Does that mean that how something's grown would also affect the quality of the ferment? So if, for example, it's organic, it's better.
And there's not a lot of hard scientific research to back it up. But when you are fermenting with vegetables that you've just picked from an organic garden and you're making it with your own hands, you'll see a massive difference between that and buying something that's non-organic from the supermarket. And then if you were making it in a food processor as well, there would be a difference because the microbial impact and input would be lower with the produce that's not organic, because it won't. And there are studies that show it. Organic produce does have more beneficial microbes on it. And because it kind of makes common sense. If you think you're putting chemicals on food to kill the pests, it will also kill, some of the beneficial bugs as well. And it won't quite have that diversity because you're not putting the richness into the soil as well.
Yeah, I guess that ties in with foraging as well, which you mentioned as a kind of good source of produce to preserve or to ferment. So I'm guessing if you kind of forage locally, maybe you're getting, I don't know how much this is backed up with evidence, but I've heard it said that if you're eating locally, it's a bit like inoculating your soil with something that you found in the local woodland. You're in that area, it's tying into your locale and everything. So I'm guessing that's also a benefit to go and forage.
Absolutely. And there are some really interesting studies that are underway and a documentary as well, which I don't know when it's due out, but there's a forager based in Scotland called Monica Wilde. She wrote a book called The Wilderness Cure. And initially when I saw the title, I thought it was more about the mental health benefits of foraging, because it is great. It feels like every time I go out foraging, which is most days, I feel like I've done yoga for an hour, but it is also about the gut health benefits of wild foods. And she teamed up with Zoe and Tim Spector to get a gut health test before living off a wild food for a year with a friend of hers. And they did gut health tests throughout the year of living off a wild food and saw a very positive result. And her friend, who she was doing the experiment with, he was type 2 diabetes at the start and wasn't at the end as well. So it can have a great impact on overall wellness. But the microbiome did show a great improvement with the input of just wild foods in their diet. They had more diversity, but wild foods are also perennial plants that come back. So even just growing perennials in your own garden, those root systems are going to tap in deeper into the soil, which will increase the microbial diversity because they can get to other bits of the soil that annual crops that have shallower root systems can't necessarily tap into.
Well, I guess that ties in as well with the idea, because you talk about how the growing year can be captured in terms of fermentation and preserved, and you can have it at different times of the year. But it's almost like a sort of a document of the year. And it's like a calendar of this was happening then, and I've got this thing now that I can bring forward with me. It's a really good way of documenting your growing year or your foraging year.
Absolutely. And what's interesting, I mean, when I was writing the book, which I had a whole year to write it, all of last year I wrote it, and looking at it this year too. And when last year was interesting because there were a few bits of produce which I'd earmarked for certain seasons. And I realized actually you can't just put plums in summer or autumn because they straddle. But also they sometimes, I mean, I've seen loads of plums. I actually, that's what I was doing before I joined this call, is I was fermenting the last batch of plums that I picked because they're raining from the trees now, and blackberries as well. They're earliest I've ever seen them, actually. So if I was writing this book this year rather than last year, I probably would have put blackberries in the summer. Whereas traditionally they're more in that sort of right on the edge between the dividing line between summer and autumn. But we're still a bit of a ways from autumn. We're not even in August. And it's crazy. The seasons change so much. But it was interesting reflecting back on the book when I was writing the intro, because I do that at the end. So I'm looking at the whole book as a piece of work. And I think, oh God, I didn't realize how much of a journal it was, capturing moments and trips I had done and what I had fermented along the way. And then the ones that I go back to year after year as well. Those ferments are the main bulk of the book, the ones that I'll always do every year. It sort of earmarks the beginning of certain seasons, like wild garlic season. I always pick the wild garlic and make it fermented pesto. That's my sort of annual tradition.
Yeah, that's really nice. That's like you say, it's a tradition, isn't it? What I was shocked about was how many different types of things that you can do with fermenting. None of it came as like a kind of shock in terms of, oh, I've never heard of that before. But it's just that you don't, I think, sometimes think that what you're doing is fermenting when you're making these things.
Absolutely. And my grandparents fermented. I was doing a workshop on sauces just before this. And I had some green chilies I'd fermented just in salt and water. And my granddad always had those on the table. And it wasn't like his hipster fermented chili sauce. It was just he grew chilies. He liked hot things on his food. And he always had a jar of it on the table. And my grandmother always made sauerkraut. And so it was very much part of my life growing up. But I didn't know it was, to be honest, I didn't really clock that I had this exposure until I really got into fermented foods. And then I realized that I've always been into fermented foods. I just didn't know they were called fermented foods.
No, and the other thing that I didn't consider the sort of sweet side of it. I tend to, I think, relate them to being savoury, but you make loads of stuff as well that's actually sweet, don't you?
Absolutely, yeah. And I've had a lot of fun, and there's way more fun to have with the baking side of things too. So I've been taking in my first fermentation book, which I did for River Cottage, part of the handbook series. I did like sourdough donuts. I took my grandmother, she used to make these really lovely, like they're the sort of American version of a milk bun. So kind of an enriched dough, kind of not quite brioche, but almost there. And I took that and fermented it. And I thought, oh, actually, this dough could work as a donut. And so I made like fermented donuts. And then I took a rye bread sourdough loaf, and then I put some fruit and a little bit of extra sweetness. I put blackstrap molasses in it, and it turned out to be kind of like a Jamaican ginger cake. And I, played with it, and I put some pears into it, which adds more microbes and sugars for the bacteria. And I just told Hugh Fernley Whittingstall, who I worked with at River Cottage, he came for dinner the other night, and I said, oh, this is my new book. Actually, I've taken one of your recipes and I've turned it into a sourdough recipe. He has a 10-minute chocolate chip cookie recipe, which I love. And I've turned it into a sourdough double chocolate chip cookie recipe with some fruit added to for more fiber and more benefit for the microbes. So you can have so much fun just taking classic recipes and then turning them into fermented ones, which will boost the flavor and the nutritional value.
Yeah, and the other thing that I didn't realise was how quickly you can do some of it. I think a lot of people associate it with doing something, then there being lots of stages to the process, and then it taking ages to actually come to something. But some of the stuff that you do in the book is literally overnight, I think, if you leave it out on the counter.
Absolutely. And I did some for people who like, fermented breads and want sourdough and the benefits from it. You can actually make an overnight sourdough starter from scratch by just adding, rather than adding water, add liquid that has the beneficial microbes in it to start with, like kombucha or some yogurt or kefir. Whisk that in with some flour, and then you have a batter which you can make pancakes with, flatbreads, grissini. So it gives you kind of a head start to making these things too. So you don't have to wait, it actually only takes a week start to finish to make a sourdough loaf totally from scratch. But if we live in a modern world where you can get things instantly. So it's trying to give those tips that, do show that you can have, fermented foods as part of your daily diet without much effort.
Yeah, I remember when I was not making a very good fist of sourdough, but I did persevere for a while. My mum said to me, you do know you could have a child and it would be less work than this loaf. So
Oh, no.
you can overcomplicate it, but you can also obviously make it quite easy. The other thing that you make it look very easy, I would say. And for me, because at work we have a kitchen and, we all grow produce and we talk about fermentation, and we've had someone in to do a workshop on it, but we are still a little bit fearful and we kind of go, oh, should we be sterilising this? Should we be doing that? And you make it look very, very simple. I mean, is it literally that simple, and are we just overthinking it?
Yeah, I think that the problem is overthinking it. And the problem really goes back to the modern food system changing the way it's basically eroded our confidence around food and the natural foods. And our instincts have been sort of depleted a bit because of it. I always like to use the example, which I have mentioned in the book as well, just to try to drive it home. And the reason I'm so confident and laid back with fermenting is because now I know the science and how really, really safe it is. But I liken a bag of salad, which a lot of people buy, vegetables in plastic, but salad leaves are particularly delicate and they are housed in, plastic, which creates this moist environment. There's no salt added to them. Often there will be some sort of gas flushed into it to protect the leaves from the microbes that you don't want. So those bags of salad are actually not that great for you, and they are higher risk of all the bacteria that you're scared of when you're fermenting than a fermented jar of something, especially with salt, because the bacteria that you want, the beneficial bacteria, they love salt and they also love being starved of oxygen. And when you're making a fermented pickle, sauerkraut, kimchi, you're creating that environment where those microbes thrive, and the microbes that you don't want, the bad bacteria, the salmonella, botulism, listeria, they hate that environment. They aren't salt tolerant and they don't like to be starved of oxygen. So instantly, when you put something in a jar in that environment with the salt and then it's airtight, the bad microbes, if they are present, will die off. And the good microbes increase. And as they increase, they create lactic acid, which is the further nail in the coffin for the bad bacteria, because that lactic acid makes a really acidic environment that bad bacteria, if they were lingering about and trying to hold on for dear life, that would be the nail in the coffin for them. So they would die off. And you can get for £20 online a pH meter to read the pH, which is the acidity level of your ferment. And if it's under 4.3, it's super, super safe. It means that basically above 4.3, you can get salmonella and some other bad bacteria. But below that, they won't survive. So you know that if you were to drop salmonella spores into that sauerkraut that usually is around sort of under 4 pH, it won't survive. They'll just die off because they can't cope with that environment. So that hopefully gives a bit of reassurance that it's super safe. It is really as simple as just putting some veg in a jar with some salt. And I talk about the ratios you need for different things, sealing it airtight, and then off you go. It's super safe and becomes more delicious and easier to digest and much better than a bag of salad.
Yeah, I'm sure. I mean, especially after the problems they've had with bagged salad
Well,
recently.
exactly.
So I may regret asking this and you may not want to answer, but if you wanted to test your microbiome, how would you go about it? And did you retest it and was it kind of much improved?
Yeah, I've had a few tests, and I was blown away by the second test I had because it came back with a diversity score of 9 out of 10 from my 0 out of 10 experience.
Wow.
And one of the tests I really recommend is one from Chuckling Goat. So Chuckling Goat is a brand of kefir. It's made by a woman called Sean Jones in Wales. So she's a farmer's wife, and she was turning the compost, funny enough, when she had a thought to make kefir to help cure her family's eczema. So they had skin problems as well. And she just was thinking about the process of compost and the process of fermentation, because composting is a type of fermentation. And she did some research, realized that kefir was a great food for helping rebalance the gut, which can help rebalance the body. In her case, her family's, skin problems also disappeared. So she became really obsessed with the power of fermented foods on the gut. And she's created a whole team of scientists and a whole lab that does gut health tests, and a whole team of nutritionists that help support people that have had her test as well. So her tests are really good, and it's Chuckling Goat online. And there's a whole section on the microbiome tests, which are around, I believe they might have changed in price. They're around £200. You get for that like a 24-page report that gives you a whole insight to what's going on inside your body, which is fascinating. It's like your own personal like microbiome novel that tells you which bacteria that most healthy biomes have, your percentages, what's a healthy normal, what the different bacteria do, and then what you can do to help readdress any imbalances in your gut. And her test, I've compared it with the Zoe test, and it's very similar. But Zoe, Tim Spector's sort of wellness brand, and his gut health tests are also very extensive and also very, very similar. So either of those are really good options.
Yeah, good to know. So I know obviously you've been out harvesting plums, and it is really early. We're nowhere near. I'm down on the south coast. We have blackberries ripening, but plums I've not seen any, in our vicinity. So yeah, but it is a crazy year. Completely agree. Apart from the plums, what else are you doing at the moment that you're particularly excited about?
Oh, well, I have been doing, and I think because I've just done this workshop, but I just made, and it's in the book as well, it's one of my favorite things, is a Thai green curry paste that's fermented. Because we have in the garden at River Cottage at the moment, we have some fresh coriander seeds, which add such a zing to the mix. And then I have lots of coriander leaves, and then there's lots of basil at the moment that's growing beneath our tomatoes. So I've just blended some into a paste, and it's bright green and luscious. I'm also picking sloes, and I ferment those like olives. So last year I picked sloes in July, and they were green because I was trying to get like a green sloe olive, which I have now that they're on the edge of being ready. I usually age them for a year, but today I ran past the hedge and the sloes are already purple, which is insane. I've never seen them this early. There's also so much other stone fruit. So some of the stuff we're getting imported from Italy and Spain, but nectarines and peaches, I've been doing fermented barbecue sauce with those, which is really fun. And lots of honey fermented fruits as well. So I have a whole section and loads of recipes. I would actually tucked in a few extra recipes right at the end of doing the book on how to ferment fruits with honey. And then I have a seasonal option for each sort of seasonal chapter.
Brilliant. And my last question, because I could honestly listen to you for hours, because this is fascinating and it's really something that I'm going to try and get my head around. If you said to somebody, this is a really easy place to start, it's a really versatile ferment to have and to use, what would you recommend?
My sort of top easy ferment is, and I have a version, slightly more complicated version in the book, but this most simplistic version is fermented carrots. And I actually have started calling them resurrection carrots, because if you have carrots at the bottom of your fridge that are a little bit bendy, a little bit sad, they might have a few little blemished bits on them, cut those off. You don't want any sort of bad bits on your produce when you're fermenting it, but just cut them into batons or slices, bundle them into a jar. You can add some spices or some herbs if you like some coriander for that classic combination, or I love lemon verbena or dill, and tuck that into a jar and then make a brine mixture, which you would get 4 grams of salt, just under a teaspoon of salt, 100 milliliters of water, whisk that up and pour that over the carrots, make more if you need it to cover the carrots completely. And then I just put a few bay leaves on top of the carrots just to give them a little protective layer. And I fill the jar right to the top with that mixture of salt and water, which is called a brine. Seal the jar, leave it for 2 weeks. And when you open it, the carrots will still be crunchy and firm, but they'll have this little softness to them and a little bit of saltiness and a hint of sourness, but they still have a bit of sweetness as well. And they are so delicious. And anytime I serve them on a course, people are blown away by how complex a really humble, simple carrot can taste when it's fermented.
Thanks to Rachel for sharing her incredible knowledge and showing us that fermentation doesn't have to be complicated or intimidating. If you enjoyed today's episode, you might also like episode 371, Wild Edibles, and episode 306, The Soil Habitat. You'll find links to both in the show notes, and as always, thank you for listening. Next up is Benny with his insect of the week.
The bee wolf. Scientific name, Phyllanthus triangulum. So my insect of the week today is a solitary wasp known as the bee wolf. Very exciting. And I hope you've heard of it, but if you haven't, prepare yourself. There's a bit of a mad ecology around it. So the etymology, Phyllanthus comes from ancient Greek, meaning flower lover. The second word in the scientific name, triangulum, comes from Latin, relating to the triangular patterns on the abdomen, more clearly visible in the males. That quite a useful descriptor. 40 years ago, this species was a great rarity in the world of Hymenoptera, so in the world of bees, wasps, ants, and sawflies. This was really rare. So the primary prey of this solitary wasp, this hunting wasp, is honeybees. And so with the uptake of honeybee keeping across the UK, it's skyrocketed, the species, and the distribution now goes all the way up to Scotland. So beekeeping is a conversation for a completely different episode, but the prey increase has led to an increase in the predator. So it's not the only species that the bee wolf will take as prey for its young, but it is the main one. So before I go into the full ecology, the madness, then I want to quickly talk about the habitat and the flowers you might see it on. So it's typically seen on sandy ground, often very sandy ground, sand dunes and sandy paths. But I've seen it increasingly in kind of sunny garden loam, very free draining soils, quite compacted. And I think it's adapting a little bit. The flora, naturally, it would be very much on things like our native sea holly, but with the kind of the introduced Eryngium species like Eryngium planum, it's really at home with that. Ragwort, creeping thistle, brambles, things like that. But it will be just taking nectar from plants rather than pollen collection, because it's a hunting wasp, and the female will be hunting for prey for their young to develop on. So, as I mentioned, the prey is almost exclusively honeybee. And what she does with honeybees is quite astonishing. So the honeybee has a kind of chink in its armor underneath its chin, so that's where she paralyzes it. Now, she doesn't want the honeybee to die. She wants it to be kind of, 80% alive, paralyzed, still aware of its own existence, but not dying and degrading. So she stings it under the chin. Then she sucks the honey out of the honeybee, which is a mad facet. She sucks the honey out because microorganisms might come in and start to consume the honey as well as the paralyzed prey for her young. So she doesn't want that. So she sucks the honey out. And also, notably, she may also at times of hardship use male bee wolves. She might paralyze them and provision them for her young, which is another mad facet I learned in a book. So she's sucked the honey out. She's paralyzed the honeybee from underneath the chin, typically. And then because bees are known to be quickly taken up by fungi. So you don't want your prey for your young, food source for your young, to be engulfed by fungi. So she needs to do some things now. This is where the biochemistry comes in. So she sucked the honey out. She's paralyzed the prey. She's got a sandy burrow where she's going to put the honeybee paralyzed into each sandy little chamber or brood cell, and then she wants to lay an egg on it. And her young will hatch out and develop on that. So what she wants to do is she wants to embalm the prey. So she licks the honeybee, the paralyzed honeybee, minus the honey. She licks it all over. And she's embalming it with her spit, basically, to create an antibiotic environment initially. And then the baby and the prey are going to end up in a water repellent casing. The second trick is antibiotics. So she actually injects the swaddle babies with antibiotics from her antennae. So these are kind of whitish masses onto the walls of the baby's cocoon, and therefore it'll kill any fungus inside. The larva, the grub, when hatches out, then spreads this bacteria, the Streptomyces bacteria, around the nursery area, like a toddler might spread bacteria around its own nursery. And then the female young solitary wasp are then also protected for life with this Streptomyces antibacterial, or bacteria, sorry. So this is antibiotics in action through nature. Streptomyces is the basis of about 80% of the antibiotics in the world today that humans use. So she's protected her young and the quarry for the young to develop on. That's the protein that the young need to develop on. So even the bee wolf eggs emit a toxic and volatile gas into the nursery, nitric oxide. This is also antifungal, but good news is that doesn't affect the wasp's Streptomyces bacteria, the helpful bacteria. So this is like the cleanest nursery ever. And so the scientists have been studying this and fascinated by this for over 100 years. The famous Jean-Henri Fabre, the French entomologist that was studying them, over 100 years ago. And he got it a little bit wrong. He couldn't quite get it all together, but he pieced together some of this process. Absolutely fascinating. These are solitary hunting wasps that are really important. They'll keep honeybees numbers down in the tiniest amount. They won't have an impact on a colony, but they're really crucial to the landscape. It shows you that honeybees kind of do have a place, although we are over-farming them and overstocking them in many areas. And I really hope you've seen one. Hope you've seen one giving a honeybee a nice death cuddle. And if not, I will share an image or a video on Instagram. So please do record and put on iNaturalist any sightings.
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.